Last Pint Productions presents the New Way podcast. The New Way contains adult content and is recorded in advance. The following episode was originally recorded on January 14th, 2021. Listener discretion is advised.
So you were in Vietnam, if I'm not mistaken?
Yeah?
Were you in the shit?
Yeah, I was in shit.
Last night, Darth Vader came down from planet Vulcan and told me that if I didn't take Lorraine out, that he'd melt my brain.
Here's how you get him. He pulls a knife, you pull a gun. He sends one of yours to the hospital, you send one of his to the morgue.
We came, we saw, we kicked its ass.
Everybody wants to be naked and famous. Everybody wants to be just like me and naked.
Will you help teach me about this? What is it? A new way?
Hello and welcome to the New Way podcast, where we break down pop culture so you don't have to. I'm your host, Matt Shank, joined by my great co-host, Mr. Ben Wilson.
Great co-host, wow.
Great, yeah.
Okay.
Well, I'm just laughing because I go, I hit record and I go 5 seconds room tone, and then I just hear a guttural burp
it
starting
wasn't even a burp.
inside your
It wasn't
body.
even a burp. Yeah, it was just my body making noise.
So that was why I was a little off on the intro. But yes, welcome back to the New Way. This is our first episode of 2021. That's right, 2020 is over. It's done. It's gone. It's behind us, and we are starting anew with a vaccine and all kinds of good things, hopefully, in store for 2021. And of course, great episodes of the New Way. Now, there's something important we need to go over right away here.
I mean, great is subjective, but
yeah. I think they're going to be great, and here's how
I think they're going to be better than ever.
Fantastic.
I mean, unfortunately, we're not taping this one, but I've got a relatively clean shaven face, which is a weird thing.
I was gonna mention I opened up my social medias on New Year's Day. And I saw a face staring back at me that I did not recognize, and I didn't understand why this person was there. But it was Mr. Wilson with nary a hair on his chinny chin.
Yeah, new growth. New year, new growth.
That sounds terrible. What was there an impetus behind this, or just decided?
I had decided way back when I was just like, right after the New Year, and I hadn't said like on New Year's Day, but I basically said, right after the New Year, I'm going to shave. Just because I hadn't done it in so long. And I was just like, it could be fun. Just try something new. And then I shaved, and then immediately like my kids ran screaming, and my wife didn't go to bed with me for 2 weeks. So it won't be long before the beard's back. But
yeah, I see some growth happening already. It's funny because
that was just me. That's just because we did our first podcast. I mean, that growth is happening right now.
So I had a similar thing that I was going to cut my hair at the New Year, and then I kind of and I was like, I don't know, I spent all this time growing out this beautiful mane of obnoxious hair, and then as if a sign from above, on Monday I found my own hair in each of the meals I had prepared that day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I pulled a long, matte head hair out of the food, out of my mouth.
That sounds like the beginning of a Stephen King story.
It was so gross. It grossed me out, and it is my own hair. But I was like, you know what? That's enough. And so I placed my order on Amazon on Tuesday for clippers, which will arrive tomorrow. And
I placed my order on Amazon for a hairdresser. He's coming tomorrow. He's got great reviews.
He's
really
lovely.
Fabulous.
He is truly lovely. But yeah, I couldn't deal with that. So I'm going to buzz it all up.
If you're privy to video on this, I see that there's a bottle of Revival Rye whiskey sitting right behiund you from Charleston, South Carolina. How is it?
I am. Yes, I'm having some new Southern Revival Rye whiskey that was a birthday gift from. Well, we're going to call him Mr. for just a moment, but we're going to get into that's not quite the real name for him. But yes, I'm drinking this rye whiskey. It's delicious. This is my birthday present from Ben, and
so it's good.
I love it.
I'm just happy it's good.
Yeah, it's very tasty. So this is a point of business we need to get to here, because I want to make sure, as a podcast and as people behind this podcast, that we are that we're showing the respect that we deserve, nay, that we have earned. And as such, there was a little change that happened over the last month with Ben, myself, and our other co-host, Nick. And that is that we are officially, all three of us, Lords of Kerry. We are Irish Lords. We are allowed and encouraged, and others are encouraged to use the title for us. So no misters anymore. It is Lord Benjamin Scott Wilson, Lord Nicholas Paul Santa Croce, and Lord Matthew Andrew Schenk. And this is true. We have purchased a small plot of land in Ireland.
I think we should just call you Lord Moss, which just means Lord Moore.
So I'm going to read you what is on our certificate, lest you think this is not serious. And I think some of you out there are snickering to yourselves right now. But this is true from the recognized authority of the Lords of Ireland, which are they're an offshoot of the Lords of Acid, but not exactly the same. As owner of property on the one part and the person named below in the other part, this deed confirms admission into the Society of Joint Owners of our land in Ireland. As owner of land in Ireland, the above is now specified as Tirana, which means both landowner and lord or lady. With this transfer of joint ownership, we bestow on you right to use this title, signed by the director, Daniel Van Hoogen, who sent us this all the way from Ireland via Berlin. Via Berlin. But yes, we are now all officially lords, and some of my high school friends and I, we also got in on this. So we have lords and ladies there.
Oh, so now I think we should just rename it the New Lord Podcast. We're all new lords.
A lot of people are going to be looking for Lord, like Lord, and it's going to be the New Lord Podcast, which I don't know if that's going to. That said, I did try
the New Way. We already get enough Christian, accidental Christian listeners with the New Way.
So yeah,
it's the New Lord.
This is a good segue, actually. So we have a new toy on the New Way. Ben is not familiar with this.
Is it the thing we were talking about right before we got on air?
No. Could be. No. So I have I've kind of set up my whole house with Alexas to be able to play music and things, and I decided, it'd be interesting if I set one of them up in my office and hooked it to the soundboard, and this now exists. So we can now say things like, computer, I've got 99 problems.
But a glitch ain't one.
That's right, but a glitch ain't one. Or I can say, computer, open the pod bay doors. Computer, open the pod bay doors.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that. I'm not Cal, and we're not in space.
Now, one thing computer is not good at, I'm sorry, computer stop. I didn't like that I called it out. Our AI is not capable of finding our own podcast. So I had gotten really excited.
Find the New Way Podcast.
So I go,
in
computer, play the New Way Podcast.
Getting the 3 questions with Andy Richter from Apple Podcasts. Playing the latest
computer,
episode.
stop. Yeah. That's better than what it was giving me before, where it was sending
Andy
me
Richter. I mean, sure.
to Christian podcasts. But yeah, so we now have
the Lord
and Alexa here, and we can, if you guys ever have something you want us to ask, or if Ben, you have something that you want to know, or we need a factoid, we can go ahead and ask our little AI friend here to give us some information.
So I can even ask here?
I don't know. I don't think it'll recognize you. I think you have to relay it to me. You could hold it up just on a sign, and that'll work. So that was So we are lords, or Lord of Kerry, as Ben wants it to be, where we all are Lord impersonators, and we are bestowed as owning Lord artifacts. And we've got our fun thing here. So that's really all we have for you for the new year. Is there anything you want to discuss, Ben, before we get into our topic?
Not particularly, but I hope everyone had a very safe and healthy and happy holiday that listens to the podcast.
Yes.
And yeah, we're a new year. So I say, let's just kick ass this new year, and let's make 2021 our bitch.
Absolutely. Yes. That is the way to go. Now, so we have a little bit of we discussed on our break time some things to kind of help the show from not feeling too stale or too kind of rote. And we've also just exhausted like every genre and conceit and everything. Not all of them,
Just you wait, Matt.
We've gone through a lot.
We have not spoken about, the origins of film noir and pre-code film quite yet. We haven't done that podcast, so
yeah, that'll be the Mank podcast, and I will actually be okay with that. Yeah, we decided we kind of wanted to do some more kind of more deep dives on familiar movies and classics, and maybe even some new movies, and also pair them up with maybe another movie in certain situations where we feel they have a good complement.
I'm not sure, like. There's a thing, and I forgot who it is that does it. It's either Joe Blow Movies or somebody like that. They do something called What's the Difference, where they compare typically books or to their adapted properties in film. And they say, okay, well, here's what happened in the book. Here's what happened in the movie. So I would have called this What's the Difference if that didn't already exist. However, we have to come up with a much more clever way of saying what's the difference, because I think our concept is to take two similarly like but diametrically opposed properties and discuss them ad nauseum, and to do a deep dive on both of them, both to get some clarity on some of the background behind the films themselves, but also sort of what they both mean in popular culture, and then how they kind of movie fight with one another in those kind of paradigms, if that makes sense.
And some of these are going to be, they're not going to be, not all of them are going to be like unclear connections. I think we will get to some that are going to be a little, like today's one is a very obvious connection, since it's the conceit behind it's the vehicle literally in one case.
We aren't doing a 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon from Catch-22 to
no.
You Got Mail.
But yeah,
we're talking about two. For a while, I think I like the idea of this concept being that we're going to do two movies that are similar enough in concept or conceit that they deserve to be discussed alongside one another, but their cultural significance may differ, or their reaction, their popular reaction may differ. I really like the idea of doing that. I have a couple ideas of some that where one is critically acclaimed and the other is completely panned.
Sure.
Matrix 13th Floor.
Yeah. Oh, I'm already ready for that episode. In fact,
I'm sure
I could do that one right now.
Episode because I think that I know what side you're going to go on.
Yeah. No, and I think
that's the side of Gretchen.
Gretchen. Yeah, it's interesting because today we're going to cover two films that deal with time travel, and there are lots of movies that deal with time travel, but one of them is arguably the most famous movie about time travel, and the other is arguably the most accurate movie about time travel.
So let's put it this way. There's a scene in the Avengers Endgame where time travel is brought about, and it creates a pop culture reference.
Time doesn't work that way. Changing the past doesn't change the future.
Look, we go back. We get the stones before Thanos gets them. Thanos doesn't have the stones. Problem solved.
Bingo.
That's not how it works.
Well, that's what I heard.
Wait, but who? Who told you that?
Star Trek, Terminator, Time Cop, Time After Time.
Quantum Leap.
Wrinkle in Time, Somewhere in Time.
Hot Tub Time Machine.
Hot Tub Time Machine. Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Basically any movie that deals with time travel.
Die Hard? No, that's not one.
This is known.
I don't know why everyone believes that, but that isn't true. Think about it. If you travel to the past, that past becomes your future. And your former present becomes the past, which can't now be changed by your new future.
Exactly.
And then the most famous.
So Back to the Future is a bunch of bullshit.
That's what I was going to say. So the funny line, the punchline, is one of the movies that I think that we're going to be talking about today, which is Back to the Future.
Next Saturday night, we're sending you back to the future.
Well, that's right.
Very nicely done.
And then our other, and I am so glad you asked me to pull this clip, Ben, because I would not have thought to do it, but is maybe one of the funniest lines.
It's the only funny line in the movie.
In a pop culture movie, but this is the line.
Man, are you hungry? I haven't eaten since later this afternoon.
And that is a movie called Primer, which is as far stylistically and tonally from Back to the Future as you can get, yet both movies are about somewhat the perils of time travel. or
And
hubris in one case.
And I would argue that are far more similar, and we will get to this point, that are far more similar than people might on surface level give them credit for.
Now, one thing I want to introduce right now, because I want to make sure we get to all of them, because there are quite a few. But our other co-host Nick, one of his favorite movies of all time is Back to the Future, and he was not able to do the podcast. But I asked if he could take some time to record what we're going to call Nick's Hot Takes. And based on I've not listened to any of these, but based on the sound waves I saw in my editing software, there is probably a Nick jingle kicking off each of them. But Ben and I don't know what these hot takes are. They may introduce questions or conversation for us, or completely derail things. We don't really know. We're going to find out. So I'm going to play the first of Nick's hot takes.
How many of these are there?
There are 8.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
So let's get the first one, and we'll see.
Sorry, I don't have time to join the podcast.
Let's
but
see.
In the meantime,
Let's
let me
see what happens
create
here.
a jingle and do 8 hot takes.
All right, let's see here.
You know, as a kid, I used to idolize Gordon Shumway, a.k.a. Alf. He didn't take no guff from nobody. Always had a joke or extravagant costume change at the ready. He was the picture of cool. And yet, Willie Tanner was always coming down on him for any little thing. Well, as a 37-year-old man, I've revisited some of these cherished episodes, and, well, now I think Willie was just a decent family man trying to protect the fragile life of the family cat and his daughter from getting banged by a creepy alien eating him out of house and home, all while he bent over backwards to keep Alf a secret from a cruel and bloodthirsty U.S. government bent on taking him into custody for unspeakable scientific experimentation. Alf was a dick.
So I don't think Nick understood the assignment.
I still think we should just play them randomly throughout the episode.
We are going to continue to play Nick's hot. The goal was that he would talk about Back to the Future in ways that would be interesting for us, but instead, Alf. So, so Ben,
I mean, I don't disagree with his Alf take. I mean, let's just say that.
Well, Ben, tell us some of the similarities between Alf and Back to the Future that you felt.
I mean, both involve a stranger. No. Anyways, I think probably the best place to start is with the most popular, film, which is Back to the Future. If you haven't seen Back to the Future, if you listen to this podcast and you haven't seen Back to the Future, it's probably just best that you go watch it, because culturally, there are fewer films that are probably more important, at least in my lifetime. I don't know if you agree, Matt.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's right up there with the Raiders of the Lost Arks, the Star Wars, getting into even more modern stuff like The Matrix or whatever. I mean, it is a film that took. It's not like time travel was a new thing. I mean, the early Time Machine film based off H.G. Wells. I mean, there had been plenty of time travel movies, but it was the first that brought it into this popular mainstream. Just based off of its panache, the way it was written. I mean, it was very cleverly written. Famously passed on by studios 44 times before it was actually greenlit.
And almost named the spaceman from Pluto.
Well, that was actually one of the producers' recommendations.
And that's one of my favorite anecdotes of the making of the movie is this producer, it was producer or like a studio head. It was a big big time. And basically said he didn't understand the title and thought it would be better if it was called The Spaceman from Pluto. Everyone hated it. They fought and they fought. No one could get anywhere. And then Spielberg, who is a producer on Back to the Future, and whose fingerprints are found in very key things that are in that movie, including the score and the fact that it's a DeLorean. But Spielberg literally wrote to the guy and said, "Hi, Sid. Thanks for your most humorous memo. We all got a big laugh out of it. Keep them coming." And knew the guy would be too embarrassed to admit that he wasn't joking, so he just didn't bring it up again, and they kept the movie titled Back to the Future, which is a great title. And
of course,
and I think Ben, I think one of the things about this movie that when you think about it and you think about everything that's going in, all the moving pieces, especially in the first one, the second and third have their own merits for what they are, that can be argued. But the first one is just a really tight screenplay as far as what is happening, what's accomplished, setting up the characters. You know, the opening to this movie is literally jam-packed with exposition and Easter eggs about and foreshadowing for the movie, and it does it with pretty much no dialogue other than a newscaster coming on very briefly.
And it's such a small amount of time too. It's definitely a movie that reveals itself more, which is strange. I mean, like, there are tons of movies where it's like, oh yeah, if you watch a Tarkovsky movie or whatever, you're gonna get more the second time out of you watching it. I would say that Back to the Future is probably the pinnacle of Easter egg films.
Yeah.
There's a reason why it's mentioned so many times in Ready Player One and by Ernest Cline, is because it's a movie that has so many different layers that you don't really get. And I had seen the movie probably 50 times, and then I had somebody mention to me after college, oh, you didn't notice this? And I was just like, what the fuck? You got to be kidding me. And I went back and I was just like, holy shit. Like, it was so well thought out, which is the irony is that script went through so many different permutations and so many different rewrites and stuff like that. But they were, they were on a, you know, we'll get to some background, but for those of you that haven't seen, obviously, I think everybody's seen Back to the Future, but obviously quickly surmising the plot, 1985, a guy and his inexplicable scientist friend, whose relationship is really never explained. One of the few things that's not explained in the entire movie, meet up, and he's created a time machine. However, the doctor gets assassinated. The kid accidentally goes back to 1955 and ends up meeting his parents, and accidentally sort of starts to erase his own future by allowing them not to get together.
And what's kind of amazing about the screenplay is most of the reworking of it had to do with the frame story. It had to do with what was happening on the bookends of how the time travel worked, what was being used, how like Marty and Doc kind of interacted. But the core of the movie was literally the screenwriter Bob Gale, who wrote it alongside with Robert Zemeckis, who directed. Was essentially Bob Gale had gone to his parents' house on like a Christmas break, and they broke out his dad's old yearbooks, and he saw a picture of his dad in high school, and his thought was like, oh my God, would I have been friends with
this
my
guy,
dad if we were, you know, contemporaries of the same age, which is a really just fantastic plot. Like I can't get over just that as the general conceit, just being really ripe for material. And then all of the stuff that's added around it. And I've read the original screenplay back when the time machine was a refrigerator, and they had to go to area
nuclear refrigerator.
Yeah, and they had to go to a bomb testing site and get radiate, and it was like this whole convoluted thing. And I forget exactly. I know Spielberg was involved in streamlining, like it should be something cool like a car, and then I don't remember who came up with the idea of doing DeLorean. It might have been Gale, which is great, you know, but that kind of changed it into this very science fiction-y feeling thing versus the other was just felt sort of silly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, I mean, one of the interesting things about Back to the Future is that it's so well known for being one of the tightest screenplays of all time, and that for the performances being so great,
tight.
but so tight. But it went through so many different. I mean, when it was in production, it went through so many different problems. First off, they always wanted Michael J. Fox, who is Marty McFly. Nobody else can play Marty McFly, although I have a point about that. They always wanted Michael J. Fox, and he couldn't break from Family Ties, and they couldn't do it. They couldn't get it away. So off of the strength of Mask, a totally different kind of movie, they hired Eric Stoltz. Although, however, I didn't never realize until I was doing research today that before Eric Stoltz was hired, somebody else was hired.
Oh yes,
and it was I forget his name, but he was the lead of The Outsiders. He played Pony Boy in The Outsiders.
Oh, I thought you were talking about because there was a different Jennifer as well in the original, who went on to be a famous, not famous, semi-famous actress.
Oh, well, yeah, no, I'm talking about actually before Eric Stoltz came on board. They were screen testing with Leah Thompson, Howell.
Oh, C. Thomas
Howell. Yeah, who was the lead of The Outsiders. And so he played Ponyboy in The Outsiders and was screen testing, he'd been hired. He'd been hired for the job. Wow. And they were in rehearsals and screen tests for 2 weeks. And they said it didn't work that well. And somebody was just like, let's do something, a little bit different. And then Eric Stoltz was really hot off of, even though Mask hadn't been released yet, everyone was saying, oh, this kid's really, he's a method actor. He's super great. So they hire Eric Stoltz. They shoot for 4, 5, 6 weeks. And
a lot.
Almost 6 weeks. They shoot like a third of the movie. And they're like, it's not working. So they shoot 6 weeks. I mean, basically a third to a half of the movie with their lead actor, and decide it's not working and recast because now they've been able to work it out with Michael J. Fox.
And then they recast the love interest because the new love interest doesn't work, which was Melora Walters from played famously in The Office, played Jan, the boss of Michael Scott, and is in other films as well.
So I actually have an interesting aside here because after pouring through some trivia about Back to the Future, they talked about all the people who were originally considered, the studio was considering, oh, here are some people. I do think it's really funny that Jeff Goldblum was mentioned for Doc Brown. I was like, oh my God, he was so young.
Great Scott.
I definitely got people like James Woods. I was like, well, James Woods kind of makes sense. He could probably pull something off along those lines, but he was still a little bit young. And then I realized I was reading through all these things and they were talking about Marty McFly. The studio, one person at the studio wanted is one of the few people I think could have pulled off Marty McFly. It would have been a different Back to the Future, albeit, however, the closest. And there is no comparison. I'm not saying this person could have done equally or as half a good job as Michael J. Fox did. But I think the one person who could have carried the spirit of the film and was considered for the role early on is John Cusack.
Yeah, I can see that.
John Cusack has that kind of rapid fire sort of cadence. He had that kind of charisma to be kind of bang, 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 bang. And I could have seen it being a little bit more acerbic, maybe a little bit darker.
I can see that.
Michael J. Fox is just so lovable.
It's funny is I also think I could see Stoltz as well, but it's in their thing was just literally
it's a different movie. It's a different movie.
Yeah, something just didn't gel with him and didn't gel with him and Crispin Glover. And it's weird. I mean, you can look, they've released a lot of this footage now and stills and stuff. You can see, and it's bizarre because it's same costume, same shot design.
Exact same shot.
Everything is there. It's just
they replicated every single shot.
Yeah. It looks like a bizarro world where this other thing happened.
So if you watch the movie now, even in the diner scene where he gets into a fight with Biff, there's reverse shot, and so there's a shot of Michael J. Fox punching, and then the reverse shot, the fist that's coming in is Eric Stoltz's fist.
Yeah, they say whatever they could afford to keep from what they'd shot, they had to try to do because it was costing them so much money.
It's unreal. Yeah. I mean, because imagine a studio is not going to do that nowadays. They go through the entire movie and then they just are like, well, this is going to be a write-off. We're just going to.
We're
not going to promote the movie. We won't spend any more money on the movie. We'll spend the least amount, and we'll drop it in January or February, and maybe we'll make our money back on video.
The closest they'll do is bring someone in to redirect what's going on and try to pull the performance out, which sort of what they did with Solo. From what a lot of people had said is the guys weren't getting the right performance out of him, but they didn't recast. They basically brought him in fix the performance, and they brought in an actor director, which makes sense that knows special effects shorthand and can be like, yeah, okay, you guys handle all of this crap, and I'm going to do the performance. It is. Yeah. There's a gazillion stories. Spielberg was another one that was responsible for requesting the score to be as big as it was, which is Alan Silvestri,
and he didn't like Alan Silvestri.
Yeah, and which wound up being just such an iconic, great score. But the original, whatever their original original tracks that they listened to, they did not like.
I still think it's one of the, I mean, it's one of the most, like, again, iconic scores of all time. And it's so bombastic and so like the French horn and the,
it's the only
it's a
80s
French
movie that
horn. It's a French horn driven melody in like the biggest part of the, like in the, you know, ultimate part of their theme. I mean, that was, I mean, if you want to go big, yeah, it's not Trump. You go straight up. French horn is going to carry your, you know, it's just going to be like, I mean, that's some loud orchestral music there.
Well, and it's great. I mean, that's why, you know, it's great to watch, you know, Spielberg as a producer of things that can come in and listen to a track and go like, no, this needs to sound bigger. And it's funny because the movie inherently, I think if I was watching that movie without that score, I would be thinking small, because a lot of the moments in the movie are small and you're in this you know, you're in the 50s through a whole section of it. And you've got this other stuff versus like coming out with that just like huge full orchestra is like a bold move.
So I read a note that so Silvestri turned in his like first notes or his first stuff, and so they were watching scenes and listening to the music, and Spielberg said it needs to be bigger. Yeah. This isn't gonna do anything or whatever. So then he turned in his new stuff, and Spielberg thought it was all temp tracks, and he was just like, "See, this is more like what I'm talking about. You need to tell the composer to do it." And they're like, "No, that's him. That's him. That's his new stuff."
That's so amazing.
Yeah, so I think that's. I mean,
so you're saying we can get him?
so I think we got him. But no, it really is interesting. Like all of the. I mean, first off, the movie itself is a wondrous. You know, just feat of originality, and all of the performances are just spot on and fantastic. But really, I think the thing that we want to talk about even more than anything, because I think people understand Back to the Future's cultural significance, is how the story of causality like folds in on itself. And basically, I mean, that's what the movie is about. It's about causality. So,
you know, well, I think someone has something to say about causality. So let's hear from Nick Santacroce.
Let's hear from Nick.
This should be his take on causality.
Captain America: Winter Soldier constructed a brilliant narrative about neo-Nazis infiltrating the U.S. government on every level. We applauded it for being more believable and grounded in reality.
Oh, we're getting political. Oh, that was it. Okay, well, that was a short,
I think we should save these. I think we should do one more this episode and then just save them randomly for like future.
Yeah, I don't think we're getting to a Back to the Future one. I'm starting to think there's not anything about Primer on this.
I don't think Nick understood a single thing that we were talking about.
It accomplished it accomplished what it set out to do. So we'll call it a win.
But anyways, what I was talking about was causality, and I think that if you look through the motif of most science fiction time travel based works, that causality is really the big thing about like, oh, if you go back in time and you do this thing, how will it affect your future? It goes back as far as, you know, Heinlein and the butterfly effect and all of this, you know, Wells and very, very old sci-fi, you know, novelized sci-fi. And so what Back to the Future did was do a really cute thing, which made it an insular family story where it's just like, oh, if my family breaks up, am I born? And furthermore, if my mom falls in love with me, like, what does that do?
Is that wrong?
Is it wrong?
It's now your mother is Leah Thompson. Is that wrong?
I mean, there's some fanfic out there.
Hey man.
But anyways, it very cleverly, I love how Disney passed on it because they were like, that's too risque.
Yeah, I mean, listen, there are some problematic moments in that movie for sure, that like the fact that got made with that plot line intact, it's funny because nowadays you could write around that very easily, and if you want to make it that the mom is a little bit loose and she was pretending not to be in the future and judging her kids, and you could have it that she's like with a new guy and all this stuff, and you could have like a one-off gag where she like says something, but the fact that she like plants one on him in the car is like, the movie is so gentle
It's
otherwise
pure.
that you
Yeah,
don't
it's pure.
feel it being salacious, but
then the moment
rough.
after that, that
Yeah.
kiss and the reaction afterwards makes it. I think it keeps that purity for me. I think it could have been mishandled. I don't feel like it's exploitative in the least bit.
It's not salacious.
And I don't think that there was ever any intention for it to be. I think that they definitely kind of tiptoed around all of that. But I think that the higher concept and what I love, and you can even get into Back to the Future 2 and 3 and the sequels, is that you have here are the events of the past, here are the events of the present. How is what we do in the past change what we do in the present? And then that obviously sets off this long chain of events of saying, well, okay, so at the beginning, Marty is kind of a loser. I mean, not really. I mean, he's cool, but he's from a family of losers. So if he goes into the past and changes his future, wouldn't that always have been his future? And that wouldn't have been, you get into these weird kind of time loop conversations. Yes. And I think that Back to the Future was popular enough that it really started kicking off a lot of those questions about the way that people treat time travel in popular media.
Yeah, and especially getting into the sequel. And originally, the two sequels were being written as one movie called Paradox. That was the original concept behind it, because they wanted to address that. And the second movies do. That's where you start to talk about these branching timelines and branching realities, which was basically the take that Avengers Endgame uses, that there are different timelines, and in order to restore a timeline, you have to go back and undo the things you did that changed the timeline. And it's very heady stuff that is definitely addressed more earnestly, I would say, in Primer.
Simply, I mean, I think that they stick to a linear timeline, and they basically, I think that what Back to the Future, the way they approach time travel, is they said, okay, we have timeline A. As soon as timeline A is ruptured and is changed by moving back to timeline B is the only other timeline moving forward.
Yeah.
So as people go back and change things, it changes timelines, but timeline A and B and C cease to exist. Like, essentially, they just all kind of rearranges into the one singular timeline.
Because otherwise, which is what
some people believe about time.
Well, and it makes sense if you think about Back to the Future, that if there's two timelines, there's a timeline where Doc dies and Marty McFly disappears, and he's gone forever. Like, there's a timeline where, and his parents are still losers, and now they have a missing kid that they're never going to find, because that one's now living in a different future with a different present, their present, but with different them.
But that's not the way they approach it. They approach it as a singular timeline, and that every time that timeline is remade, everything morphs into a new timeline, and that's the new past and future, essentially. And that there's all of those traces where all those places where you veered off, those disappear. They go back to the root. Yeah. It's basically like chopping off a rose, like at the stem. So every time you chop, you have this new growth, whatever, you chop it off and it goes back to that point moving forward.
Chopping off the new growth. Got it. Okay.
Chopping off the new growth. Mm-hmm. Kind of like what I did with my beard.
There it is. All comes full circle.
It all comes full circle. It all comes back to facial hair.
So what's nice, in Back to the Future, it broaches that subject much more in 2, where an alternate timeline is created that you get to see, and then you figure out how to get rid of that timeline, is go back before that timeline happened and go fix the things there. And they very neatly tie up all of their kind of little.
Which is actually one of the things I think that's really interesting, because as they develop this, okay, it's a singular timeline. So 2 is all about just altering that one single timeline within a pretty dramatic single frame of years. But what I love about 3 is at 3, they go back far enough where all of this shit could have happened on that same timeline. And it's like, okay, well, at this point, we understand we're working on almost the exact same timeline as we were before, because the butterfly effect wouldn't have caused as much back
Yeah.
then, you know, basically. And
But it's their
almost
own lives that they're working to save
yes,
at that
exactly,
point.
exactly. So it's almost a reset, and I really think it's interesting. And but that's again the thing. The further you go back, you want to reset. The further you go back, you can reset. The further you go back, you can reset if you're working on one timeline, which we're going to get into it a little bit. But it's still ultimately the reason why I'm bringing all of this up is they very clearly thought out the mechanics of how they wanted the time travel to work in their film. And while it completely differs from the way that other people approach time travel, it makes a lot of sense because the whole thing is we're talking about one timeline, the permutations that affect that timeline. How could we continue to go back and re-affect that timeline? And ultimately, it's probably the best way you can cinematically deal with time travel as opposed to doing multiple futures and multiple pasts and at least in a pop culture sense, because it provides you the ability of having, you know, you in a scene where the past you is also in the scene talking to the person who used to be your dad's bully while you're trying to get something from that. It's very cleverly conceived. And I think that for what it's worth, even though it's been improved upon many times and extrapolated upon, and you can go to Avengers and go to Marvel and talk about their time travel, which I think is cleverly done, but still builds off of Back to the Future. I think it all starts with Back to the Future because Back to the Future was the OG when it came to thinking out what causality meant in a single timeline or period of time. And for that, I think every single film that has come after owes it a debt of major gratitude.
Well, there's another thing it does, kind of a sneaky thing it does with the time travel that it doesn't seem like a lot of people mention a lot, but I do like it. And it's something that Quantum Leap borrowed quite a bit, which is the idea of let's try that again. Probabilities. So the things that happen in Back to the Future are never
you say probabilities?
I was trying to say probabilities.
I'm pretty sure that's the finishing move in Mortal Kombat.
Oh man!
Probability is where they just sit there and wait till
been a while
dies.
since I've been on the mic, man. No, Quantum Leap did a kind of a thing with this idea that the small changes you make impact the future in certain ways. So Back to the Future does that via a simple device of a photograph. That Marty has a photograph of his family, and it's starting with the oldest siblings going down to the youngest sibling, which is him. And they're slowly disappearing as he is more negatively impacting the timeline. So he has caused the moment, the meet cute his parents have talked about in the beginning of the movie where they met at the dad hits him with the car. He's impacted that. Now the mom is more interested in him.
I knew I was going to spend the rest of my life
with him. She talks more like
and then it cuts to Chris McGlover. He's like
no, it is interesting that it's clever storytelling in that there's no scientific reason behind it. But again, it's time travel. So really what science do we really understand? But that things are not immediate so in Back to the Future 2, when Biff goes back in time and he creates a new timeline where he becomes Biff Trump in the tower in Hill Valley, and he comes back to the future.
Donald
Biff Trump. When he comes back to the future, he's like dying and he doesn't understand what's going on. And there's a bit where he gets out of the DeLorean and he's dying. And it's because it didn't happen instantaneous. He didn't go and give the almanac to young Biff and then boom, like that.
Yeah.
The timeline changed. It's like the effects of it take time to catch up to the people that are causing all of these changes, which is good from a plot standpoint that allows them to be able to do stuff that because technically as soon as Marty stops the car from hitting his dad, he should just disappear. Like that's kind of the idea is that he's stopped this thing and but instead he gets a chance.
Like I said, they they made the rules. Like, so that's the thing. It's like, they
Exactly.
were like, here, we're on a singular timeline and we're going to make the rules. So
Yeah.
this doesn't happen instantaneously. It's going to take X amount of time. It's going to take 5 days, for these things to actually happen or whatever, to permutate into an actual cohesive thing for the future. So, yeah.
Probabilities. Yes.
Probabilities. I think
Familiar.
actually, I like it. I like it. I think it's the new term we should use.
So let's get into our second movie, and this may be a movie that some of you have heard of or seen or
heard us talk about,
heard of and haven't seen or have been afraid to watch. And this is definitely one of those kind of Donnie Darko I'm calling it from a cult standpoint. There's a certain group of people that saw Darko and became obsessed with it, and saw Primer and became obsessed with it, and watched these movies, because it's not a mainstream, it's a movie that true nerds talk about. Like, that's, it's not a common thing. It's sort of that badge of honor of like, have you watched Primer? And I think some people also laud it a little bit too much in that kind of like, oh, you like Back to the Future, you obviously haven't seen Primer, because that's the gold standard of how time travel should be. But they're not entirely wrong, because it's a very mathematically told, at least as far as the mechanics of time travel are much more mechanical.
I mean, it still doesn't make any sense.
Sure, because it's time travel.
Because it's time travel. But the way that Primer approaches it is that the people who are involved are not looking to solve a way to travel through time. They're looking for something very practical that they could make money on, and they happen upon time travel. But the sequence of happening upon time travel, I think, is the best and most realistic sequence of that happening, which is one of my favorite scenes in the movie. That there's a long buildup for about 25 minutes of these guys who they're all engineers, and they all work for a firm, and they, the reason why the movie is very inaccessible for a lot of people is because it's entirely inside baseball. The people they're speaking in engineering terms. Nobody understands what they're actually talking about, but you can understand like the goal of kind
Sure.
of what they're like. Oh, we're trying to create something. And they're like, oh, they were creating these motherboards for computers. And then somebody else was just like, well, I have a better idea. So the guy was like, I have a better idea. And so they're trying to create something to make some side cash.
They're kind of like a mini think tank.
Yeah, they're looking for they're like an incubator, and they're looking for the next big break.
And their thing is that they're trying to reduce mass on something, right?
So the idea is they're trying to basically create an anti-gravitational chamber, which is what it comes down to. And the idea is that if they could micro size anti-gravitational chamber, that it would change the way that people could ship things, because you would never have to deal with weight again. Like, imagine freight. And by the way, this isn't talked about in the movie. This is all an extrapolation of all the stuff that they talk about in engineering terms in the movie. I've only seen the movie 70 times, so I know what they're talking about. They're talking about like imagine having like thousands or tons and tons of pounds that would typically go on a freighter, and packaging them in a box that would essentially render them weightless. Now, from an efficiency standpoint, what's that going to do to the freight industry? And that's the idea. Like, they have these big ideas or whatever. So that's the concept. And they're trying to micro-size it and then probably sell it to a bigger company. They're just these guys in a basement, or in a garage in this case. So they inadvertently create time travel.
With a device that they never call a time machine. It's always called the box.
They never say time travel. They never say time machine in the movie. They call it the device, or they call it the box. And it's exceptionally, and again, I've said it before on the podcast. I'll say it again now. Primer is the best time travel movie ever made. And I put it above Back to the Future just because for me, the rewatchability and I would almost put them on equal footing because the thing is from a pop culture standpoint, Back to the Future is so well known and so well respected and for all the right reasons. Primer to me is inaccessible in all of the right ways. It's the movie that I can continue to watch. It's one of the few movies I watched once and immediately watched right after it again because it was an hour and 20 minutes long. I watched it with a friend who was an engineer, and he said, "Let's watch it again," because we wanted to understand what was going on better.
This is what is always funny when Ben and I are talking about this. We had literally the exact same first viewing of this movie, which was, and for my high school friend listeners out there will know this name. And today is his birthday, actually. But my old roommate, Spencer Schrader, who's an engineer.
Happy birthday, Spencer.
Who now works with John Reinsvold. But that's a whole other thing.
Wow.
But yeah, we watched the movie and it stopped and he immediately went back. He was like, let's put it on again. And like watched it again and took notes, like to the point of like need to understand this. And what's really fun about looking at these two movies side by side is how they handle each of the beats in the story. And it's very much a testament to the major differences in these two movies, which Zemeckis is going to be talking about being much more flash and sizzle versus Primer's being much more gut punch kind of reveals of things. So you know both of these movies start and we don't know that they're necessarily about time travel. Back to the Future you probably do, but you know.
Here's the way I equate it. I consider Back to the Future kind of a fun house because you never know what's around the next corner. It's always going to be entertaining. It's always kind of fun. I think Primer is a movie where you're standing on top of a rug and the rug is being pulled out from under you, but it's so slow you don't notice it. And that's my kind of like.
Well, and it's like I kind of want to look at two scenes side by side, right? So both movies have a pretty long preamble, right? And people kind of forget that, I think, with Back to the Future, is that it's a while before you head back to 55. I mean, you've got to go through all of Marty's setup. You got to get through all of the setup with the parents, the battle of the bands.
You're a bum. That's all you'll ever be.
Yeah.
A bum.
There's a lot going on. And then we get to this. Then we get to like a moment where someone is introducing the other person to time travel. And that's it. Both movies follow the exact same thing. Someone is introducing someone to time travel that doesn't know they're being introduced to time travel.
But before you say it, I mean, I love the line in Primer where so you don't know. I mean, obviously, if you've done any research or you know what you're getting into, this is a movie about time travel. But when Abe and Aaron first kind of talk in this period, there's a very, very short scene where he walks up to him and says, he's like, "Do you have anything important at work today?" He's like, "Oh yeah, are you sure there's nothing important?" He goes, "Well, if you ditch work today, I'll give you a deal. If you promise to ditch work today, I'll show you the most important thing any organism has ever witnessed on this earth." And that's the selling point right there. You're just like, oh shit, which is a movie with no stakes. It's just a chill movie.
Well, and you have no
engineers hanging out to that point, and all of a sudden you're just like, oh shit.
And you don't know what are they? What have they? I mean, at that point, that movie, you know, we've talked about.
There's a 10-minute sequence of him explaining how time travel works.
Well, it's
with the other guy not understanding what is happening, which is great. But he is understanding what's happening, but that's great.
Yeah, it's interesting because you've got, you know, talk about this a lot in movies where certain movies have setups and acts that can go in 1,000 different directions at certain points in the story and still work, right? And Primer's a great example of that up to that moment when he's like, I'm going to show you something that no organism has ever, the most amazing thing any organism has ever seen, you know, on this planet. That movie James Cameron could take it over and it's an alien movie and it's about alien invasion, or Del Toro could take it over and it's going to be about creating monsters and there's a fairy kingdom. Like there's a zillion places this could go, and you know they wind up going with this time travel one. But it is again there's that same parallel with Back to the Future, where it's Doc being like, hey, you got to show up to the mall tonight, bring your video camera, I've got this important thing. He breaks out this car and he's like,
918
what is this?
or whatever it is.
What's going on with the DeLorean? What is this? He puts a dog in it and he fires a car right at them.
Are you wearing a
to disappear.
Devo suit?
Like there's an amazing setup. And what I love is that we're getting this information from the characters. And then there's the moment where you realize, where the audience is now being told because the character's being told. And in Back to the Future, it's the DeLorean shows back up with the dog in it. It's ice cold. He opens it up and the stopwatch has changed. And Doc explains how kind of the time travel works and the flux capacitor and blah, 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 and sets up those rules. I really love the way they do it in Primer, because again, at this point, you don't really know as an audience member, if you're not familiar, if you haven't heard about the movie or what it's about. You've basically, this guy is taking this other dude out to a field in the middle of nowhere and gives him binoculars, and he winds up seeing the guy who's with him walking into the building with this oxygen tank. And it's just this like, what? And what's great also is even at that point, you can freeze and be like, what is the story being told here? Is this a cloning story? Is this a doppelganger story? Like, there's all this shit could happen. And then he proceeds to explain time travel. But I think you're right. And that was what I was most interested in when you kind of said, like, let's talk about how, Primer and Back to the Future, yes, they're both about time travel, but they're very different. But then there are parts of the way the movie tells these things it's interesting how they approach each of these moments they know they have to get to, which is, that setup and that reveal. How is that done based on the type of movie that's being set up?
Well, I also think it's just interesting looking at the movies the way they were made, because you have Back to the Future, which is a studio movie that allowed for 6 weeks of filming to occur and then refilm.
They lost
with major studio clout.
They must have lost 10 times the budget of Primer, even in 85, just in those 6 weeks.
So here's the thing. The reason why there's no director's cut of Primer?
I do know this, but tell.
Because he used all but maybe 60 seconds of the film that they shot. That's all they could afford. And he would rehearse like a play, rehearse. And all he got was basically one take of every scene. Shot it on Super 16 and ended up spending about $7,000 on film stock and $28,000 on the transfer stock. That's what the budget of that movie was.
I love that the biggest part of the budget was to transfer it over to his PC so he could edit. Yeah, because he didn't have a way to cut actual film. Like on cutting
First
film.
He transfer it from Super 16 to 32, and then had to digitize it. And that's what.
And then my favorite thing reading of it today that made me feel a lot better. Some of you might remember we had we briefly flirted with a great idea that Ben had this summer of a thing called Wrecked Reruns, and it kind of froze, and I'm largely to blame for that, because my episode of Wrecked Reruns has sound issues that I need to spend time syncing, and that was I read that was Carruth. He gave up in the movie 4 times in the editing bay because basically the sound was fucked, and he had to sync every single moment separately, and he was like, this is too much, this is not doable.
I mean, he was a full-time engineer. He was a working guy. he was like a fucking cubicle.
That's a really good thing, because I don't think everyone out there knows. So the director and writer and actor and producer and editor and composer of Primer, Shane Carruth, is a mathematician. He's a math major and engineer. He was an engineer. Worked in computer engineering. No interest in filmmaking. More interested in acting. Well, yeah, originally he was going to do a book of Primer, but then he realized that his stuff didn't lend itself to internal discussions. And then it seems like he's more interested in acting. He's a strange guy. I will just say where he's gone with things and how his future has transpired. He might need a box. Yeah, he's a strange guy. But this is a guy that basically approached a time travel movie and wrote it like an engineer. And that's the best way you can really describe what you're watching.
He said that he wasn't planning on being in the movie. He just couldn't. He kept on auditioning actors, and they were all just overplaying or being theatrical. And it was just like, he was like, no, this needs to be like understated. It needs to be like, you have to understand what this language is. And that's the reason why the guy who plays Abe, I forget his name, is pretty much the only professional actor in the entire movie. everybody there's one professional actor in the entire movie, which is one of the two leads.
And his character is built also to be sort of the
he's
anti-voice.
He's supposed to be a little bit more dramatic and a little bit more kind of, anyways, it's extremely interesting because he basically said he got fed up and was like, well, I don't have to pay an actor, I'll just play it myself, and then did it himself. But the guy is immensely talented and has, since releasing Primer, made a lot of friends in the industry who really respect what he does and what he says.
Sure.
Including our friend Amy Seimetz, who I think that they're not a great relationship now.
Yeah,
but
we'll gloss over that.
Yeah, that's a whole different episode.
I wasn't going to mention that, but yeah.
But Shane, he produced The Girlfriend Experience and wrote all the music for that. He works with Rian Johnson a lot.
Well, he
is a consultant on like all of his movies.
Well, and what's funny is that also he is now also, after Primer, he became the go-to person, which is funny. Which is funny with Rian Johnson, because that was the first thing he said to. He likes Looper, but he basically read the script for Looper and he's like, your time travel makes no sense at all and it doesn't work. And Ryan's like, okay, well, and they tried to work on some scenes with it together, but it's like it wasn't a good match because that wasn't the story that Johnson's telling. That's another movie that makes its rules and sets its things up, and whether it's, I don't find it to be a satisfying conclusion, but I still think the first half of that movie is fucking just
first
crazy
half is
good.
It's pretty tight.
But yeah, it is interesting that like Harut has become the consultant. Like you see his fingerprints. That whole bit we just played from Endgame, and then the talk with.
Do you not think? I guarantee you that one of the Russo brothers has had a conversation with Shane Carruth. I guarantee.
If they haven't had a conversation, I guarantee the two of them have watched that movie as much as you've watched that movie and have studied it and are.
But no, I almost guarantee you that they had a conversation with Shane.
It's something that if you're
a prerequisite if you're making a time travel movie.
Yeah, and if you're a film geek, it's likely a movie that you watched that was, and especially when the time that movie came out in it's what 2004. So that's when the Russos had they just directed the Arrested Development pilot, and they're like young filmmakers. So absolutely that movie is on anyone that was like, I remember movies that were talked a lot at that time, one of which I'm not a huge fan of where it went or even actually of the actual movie. But I remember the two screenplays and films that like film geeks and young directors and young people in film that got really into were Primer and Saw. Oddly enough, Saw was like a really big one, just from everyone loved the conceit of this idea that there's a dead body in the room and a tape recorder and like that shit.
I think that there were people that were interested in seeing kind of a revitalization of horror and going back to those 80 roots, but doing it in something a different way.
Yeah, but it is interesting. But yeah, Primer is anybody that's in filmmaking is likely watched that movie. Soderbergh's a huge fan. There are all kinds of people there.
But the craziest part is just to think about that they shot most of these scenes are one take. I mean, almost all of the scenes in the movie are one take, and they only did it one take because they couldn't afford the film for it. And that's just fucking crazy to me. It's just amazing. Oh yeah. You can't shoot. Somebody said you can't shoot under fluorescent. I'm just bullshit. Of course you can shoot under fluorescent. It's just going to tint green. Okay. Well, we want to desaturate. We want to make it look green. And I mean, he basically just did camera tests and we're just like, okay. And got his, I think, cousin to camera operate. And he basically DP'd the entire movie himself. And people have the fucking nerve to come and tell me that movie looks amateur now. I'm like, that movie looks fucking pristine. The movie so good. The shot design is so well done.
I think people are mistaking things like there's some bad grain at night, right? Like they're not great at shooting some because they're not which is fine.
They
like
didn't bleach bypass it.
Yeah, and that's like, and that's fine. But like, who fucking cares if everything else is right? And the fact is that they have a thing that they can't do just because they were limited technically by what they could get. Like that doesn't make it bad or make it shitty or make it whatever.
I think it's a very smartly shot movie. It's a very smartly made movie.
And it's a time travel movie with zero CGI in it. Not a single effects.
There's one effect shot in it.
Is that in the? When does that happen?
When they drop the paper on the thing and the paper floats up. Yeah, there's one effect shot in the entire movie that they apparently didn't have in their original cut, and I think that they got some funding to get it released, and they were just like, "We need one shot. we need this work on this one shot." It's a dolly shot that just goes back and forth really quick, but they needed these things floating up in the air, and it was the one shot that they had to have work on. But yeah,
and that's not even actually even a necessary, because that's that's like all the red herring plot of the mass device. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah,
that's kind of fun. That's actually really funny that there's like that's the only place it exists, is really the thing to sell you on what the movie is not about.
Guess how many special effects shots there are in Back to the Future?
Not as many as
33.
Yeah, that's pretty low by nowadays standards, for sure.
By nowadays standards, where you could be watching,
there are by the way, there are 33 shots without CGI in Avengers Endgame. And the rest are CGI.
Probably less.
Yeah, I'm honestly trying to think of moments that don't have at least some bit of CGI in the movie, and I don't have any.
They're probably all there.
I can't think of. You know what is? This is such a weird, stupid thing, and I apologize for this silly aside, but that clip I played of Mark Ruffalo Hulk explaining time travel. There's a moment where he has a couple of hard P's, and you can hear the mic, like the like that mic sound, and I was just like, I've gotten very much into sound from doing the podcast, so like I heard it leapt out at me when I heard it, and I was like, all the money in that movie, and they couldn't soften, like, it's because it's supposed to be a man in a room talking to people, not a guy in a mocap suit with a mic that's like picking up his sound. But it was kind of funny to me that I was like,
you
wow.
Keep the performance.
Yeah. And it's a great performance. I can't shit on anything else on it, but that just did make me feel like, okay.
Mark Ruffalo likes his hard P's. He loves those hard P's.
Mark Hard Below. What were you gonna say? Mark Hard Penis Below? Yeah.
That came out wrong, but no, Mark Ruffalo likes the hard P.
And I'm reticent to talk too much about, and I'd like to a little bit with where Primer goes and sort of what their resolution is, but I also feel if you have not seen the movie, there are some really good earned oh shit moments at the end of that movie.
So I think that we can just draw a contrast, because most people who have listened to this have seen Back to the Future, so they're going to understand. It's a feel good story at the end. It's an uplifting story. Basically, he ends up inadvertently bettering his own situation by empowering his own father, and by his own father becoming the hero in his own story, and so that ends up making his life better. Whereas Primer ends up doing something almost entirely different, where it's two friends that end up trying to continue to basically fake one another out on who they are, which is where you have overlapping timelines and overlapping personalities. And
I think
it's an interesting thing,
and that's not a terrible way, and that doesn't I don't think spoil too much. But really, Primer is the difference between Primer and Back to the Future. Back to the Future briefly but concisely touches on the two viewpoints of time travel, and they get more into that in 2 and 3, which is Doc Brown believes that Doc Brown believes time travel should be used only for purposes of exploration and understanding, and should not be used for personal gain, and you should never be attempting to change anything that has happened. So when Marty goes back, and Marty watches Doc Brown die, and he goes back in time with this information, but he's been told, but Doc Brown tells him even in the past, don't he's like, I got to tell you about what happens to you in the future. And he's like, don't tell me.
Don't tell me. You can't tell me.
I have to. This is what I have to. I have to learn this on my own. I have to go through this thing,
which is kind of a bullshit, arbitrary argument because he's already met Marty.
Yes,
and he is already doing that on behalf of Marty, so it doesn't really make.
But in his world, it's because he's only getting Marty back on the right track. It's not affecting his, whatever, supposedly. But of course,
supposedly.
But by the end of the movie, he's gotten, that gets the better of him of wanting to know what happens to himself in the future, and therefore he's able to protect himself from dying. Also, by the way, Doc Brown, kind of sketchy that he gets terrorists to rob a place of plutonium and then double crosses them. But anyway, we won't get into that.
Totally problematic character.
Very problematic. But
not to mention, like, how does he meet Marty? Yeah. Like, why are they friends?
Chat room. It's chat room. Early chat rooms. But Primer takes those two opposing viewpoints, let's call them, of protect the timeline versus benefit from the timeline, and pits them against one another in very much a cat and mouse way of like, is this something that did we open Pandora's box and can we close it, or do we open Pandora's box and we might as well do what we can with it to make things better for whatever.
And not to spoil too much, but in Primer, their first the modus operandi of the main characters is to make money on the stock market.
Yeah,
which is a perfectly legitimate thing. They're like, okay, at the end of the day, we're going to go back in time, go back to the beginning of the day, do day trades. By the time we leave where we are, and we've done all these trades, our original person is going to be back in the box. We can go home and everything's going to be fine.
Yeah. And by the way,
so operate.
We're glossing over a major part of the mechanics of how this works, but in Primer, and God, I'm going to do probably a butcher this explanation, but Primer essentially, there's a box, and inside the box, things are going from point A to point B in 1 minute intervals constantly, back and forth. So if you start the box, just call it start the box. There's probably a better technical term, but you start the box, and if you get in when it's at point B, which is in the future, you can then get out at point A, which would be the past. So the box starts at point A, it goes to point B, it goes back to point A. As long as you get in at the right point, you can surf that point back the exact amount of time that has happened.
I love the line in the movie where he's like, we're not talking about wormholes or like whatever. He's like, this is just simple like heat mechanics. And Aaron, the character, Shane Carruth's character, goes, this is not heat mechanics.
So that's the general idea. But what I also like about the motivation at that point too, and you make a good point talking about that, is that the beginning of the movie, their motivation is to create something to make money. And the thing that they're going to create in the beginning is actually problematic in that it is going to bankrupt an industry, essentially. It's going to bankrupt the freight industry. It's going to make them a shitload of money as the proprietors of this new, cheaper way to send things, and it's going to be better for everyone in general. But it's going to.
But all they wanted to be was the next Apple.
Yeah,
they were a basement industry organization.
And at the end of the day, though, they realize that like what we really want is to like we can make it. The first thing they agree on is it's just going to make money. But then you're right. Then the hubris comes in about what do they actually want. Great, like, okay, we use a time travel machine to make some bucks, and that's cool, but what else? What else could we be doing? What else could we be accomplishing with this?
And I think that the really what it comes down to is, and I don't want to ruin the movie for people who haven't seen it, but it gets to a point where something bad happens at a party, and you don't even see it happen. You just hear about it. But apparently one of the characters continues to go back to make sure that it doesn't happen badly. Mm-hmm. And to make it a quote unquote perfect moment, almost to empower themselves. And that's where it becomes more about self-empowerment, and it becomes more about them about saying, okay, well, I have the power. And one of the last lines I remember, it's one of literally the last lines between Abe and Aaron, the two main characters. He says, you have no idea what I'm capable of at this point. And it really is, it becomes a power struggle at that point where it's like, here's what I know I can do because of my capabilities and the fact that And at this point in the movie, you're talking about multiples of multiple people and stuff like that. I mean, it's Michael Keaton's multiplicity at this point.
Well, what's funny is, we won't talk more about the multiples because there's a little bit more to that, but it's very similar also to another movie that could have been part of this conversation, and maybe as we get better at these, we'll figure out good stuff to draw to. But it's very much like Chronicle, and Chronicle is a movie where characters basically get a power, right? And you can look at the time. The box is basically, as if you can look at it from that standpoint, it's power. It's a super power. They have the ability to go back in time. And what will they use that power for? And in the beginning, the second, like kind of the more assholey characters kind of use it for sort of selfish things. And in Primer, there's a great bit where they talk about like, he wants to go back in time. He wants to go and punch his boss out and then go back in time to tell himself not to punch it.
His boss, who eventually ends up going back in time, and they never explain it. And it's the one thing Shane Carruth can't explain in the movie. He's like, it was a good red herring. That was it. He said, he was like, no, I personally have no idea why like how he found the machine or how he got back in time. Like, I never thought that far ahead.
Which, I mean, like, there's a gazillion outs for it, but yeah.
Shane Carruth did not think about how his boss in the movie had gone back in time, which I think is really interesting. I was just like, oh shit, I thought he would have had explanation for everything. He was like, no, I've got no explanation for that shit.
Well, and like, I think those are really always, I like that kind of storytelling where you've got like, the person you think is going to abuse something only really wants to abuse it for a little bit, but then they kind of get to their better senses, versus the one that's supposedly doing this for altruistic reasons winds up abusing the power more because they feel they have a responsibility,
or the weakest becomes the strongest.
Exactly. And I like that. I think, I mean, it's an old storytelling technique, but it's good and it works in certain movies really well. I think in Primer it works phenomenally well, and I love also Primer ends very much open ended, where you've essentially got two gods, and what are each of them going to do with this?
Well, I mean, one's in Mexico building a box the size of a building.
And so like there's a good setup for a sequel there, which will, thank God, most likely never be made, because it doesn't need to be. But it's a great what if, because it's not anything I care to see, but it's a great thing to discuss. Like, what is he doing? What is happening at the end of this movie?
But again, I think the brilliance of a movie like Primer is its ability to realize like what it's doing within the context of a time travel movie, because there are these like the line you played at the beginning where it's just like, "You hungry? I haven't eaten since later this afternoon," which is a line that's delivered in earnest. It's not played for a laugh. It's only funny because it's ironic, which is the same thing that happens. Like, they're listening to like a basketball game at one point, and he's just like, "Dude, I thought we lost this game, or I thought we won this game by 4." And they're like, how we're losing by 3. And there's like 57 seconds left. He's just like, no, this, and so there's like a moment of concern. He's just like, oh, no. So they make the shot, but then we foul, and then that's what. Okay, fine. Okay. So
what's great is all in the same. That's literally the moment that precedes the sandwich line, or the hungry line.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's that whole sequence where they're just sitting around and they're just hanging out, and it's all of these moments that they're like, oh yeah, this is what happens. That like life is going to happen around us. It's so, and then I don't think Shane Carruth realized what he was doing. I definitely know he did know what he was doing when he wrote it, but it shows just the major creative force that he absolutely is. I mean, he's a super, super creative guy, which, if you're interested, and if you have seen Primer and you like it, I recommend seeing Upstream Color. I recommend watching The Girlfriend Experience. They're both heavily influenced by him or directed by him. And Upstream Color is fucking exceptional. Or watching any of Amy Siemens' stuff, because it's also very heavily influenced by Shane. I forgot the second thing I was going to say.
I think Upstream Color is one I've not actually gotten all the way through. To be honest,
it's a hard watch.
Yeah,
but it's so when you get to the thing is Upstream Color is a rough. It's difficult to watch because it feels kind of like a fever dream for about an hour and 10 minutes. And then all of a sudden the plot really congeals and you're just like, oh, I've got an idea of everything that was going on before now. And then it gets to the end and the end is so crystallized and so perfect. And I'm just like, I mean, it has one of the most like, holy shit moments of all time in film. I 100% believe that.
And that was that was the description that I really liked of Soderbergh described Carruth as if David Lynch married James Cameron, which is a really interesting kind of combination.
No, I don't agree with that at all.
I agree with the Lynch side of it. I don't know what the other half is. I would not say it's Cameron, but
Almost
I definitely feel
Linklater or
Lynch.
something like that. Like,
it's somebody smaller. Almost maybe Soderbergh.
I think it's actually Soderbergh and Lynch is actually actually Soderbergh and Lynch is perfect.
Is pretty close. Because there is something.
There's also some Terrence. There's some Terrence Malick in there. I mean, he's a very Malick-y kind of like. He likes to keep everything kind of visual. And in camera, especially in Upstream Color. Upstream Color is an extremely visual movie where there's not a whole lot of dialogue for basically half the movie.
For sure, man. Well, I'm gonna let us. We're gonna get taken out of this one because I think we've covered what we need to cover and wanted to cover with this.
Let's hear one more hot take.
That's we're gonna do one more hot take from Nick to lead us out. I'm almost afraid to push the button, but let's see what we get to here.
Remember what I told you earlier, Matt?
If you like raisins and rum, but not rum raisin ice cream, I can't respect you as a person.
First of all, that's directed directly at me. Well, actually, I don't really like rum anyway, but I do like raisins, but rum raisin is just fucking disgusting. But all right, well,
I love it.
Well, we got there eventually. Anyway, we're going to tie up this episode of the New Wave podcast. We'll do some more of these. So if you have a movie you want to hear us talk about or discuss, please let us know in our, send a text, send whatever. You know how to reach us. If you're listening to this show, you've got a direct line to us. If you don't, go on our website, lastpintprod.com. You'll find ways to contact us all over the place, or find us on Facebook or Instagram. We're almost everywhere but Parler. Unfortunately, our account got taken down on there.
Is it not Parlay?
Is it Parlay? No.
That's the French word for speak.
I mean, yeah, I just always thought it was like parlor tricks.
Well, I guarantee you everybody who uses it
calls it parlor. Yeah, I would not, like, voulez-vous parler? Yeah, I don't think there's a lot of people. It's parlor, my friend. It's got an R at the end. I don't know if you noticed, but it does. So anyway,
people taking away our freedoms of speech.
You won't be able to find us on Parler, but you can find us almost anywhere else.
So our good podcast services.
So yeah, wherever good podcasts are carried, just make sure you're not. If you hear a bunch of people talking about Jesus Cristo for like 20 minutes, that's probably not our podcast, but you'll find us the other way. Thanks so much for tuning in to The New Way, and we'll talk to you next time. Cheers.
Cheers.